The Sicilian sun was setting over a small hillside town, casting long shadows across worn stone houses. Inside one of them, a newborn cried for the first time, unaware that his life would one day command fear, respect, and influence across 2 continents. Born into poverty, surrounded by dust, toil, and whispered dreams of America, Rosario Buffalino learned early that survival wasn't given, it was seized. From the narrow alleys of Buffalo to the smoky backrooms of bootlegging operations, the boy who would become Russell Buffalino would discover that true power lies not in muscle, but in patience, cunning, and the ability to see the world before it sees you. This is the story of how an immigrant child rose to become one of America's most formidable figures in organized crime. The Sicilian sun had just begun its descent behind the jagged hills of Montadoro, casting a warm golden glow across the small stone houses perched precariously on the hillside. Inside one of these humble dwellings, a soft wail pierced the quiet of early evening. Rosario Alberto Buffalino had entered the world. The modest home, worn from decades of harsh weather, carried the scent of limestone, firewood, and the faint tang of the sea carried by the breeze from distant shores. Salvatore Buffalino, a man whose hands bore the permanent calluses of a lifetime of labor in sulfur mines, stood silently in the dim kitchen, a mixture of awe and trepidation etched across his furrowed brow. He had seen more struggle than most men could endure, and now, holding his newborn son in his rough hands, he wondered what kind of life awaited this child in a land that offered so little for those born into its margins. Caterina, Rosario's mother, sat nearby on a low wooden stool, her dark hair streaked with the fatigue of countless sleepless nights. She cradled her newborn with a tenderness that softened the harsh lines of her face. Though life had been unyielding, filled with scarcity and toil, she wrapped her child in the warmth of her unwavering love. The scent of her hands, a faint mix of flour from bread, olive oil and herbs, lingered on Rosario's skin. It would become a comfort, a connection to home, and a memory he would carry even as the world around him changed. In the evenings, Salvatore would sit beside the dying embers of the hearth, whispering to his wife in hushed tones. "America," he murmured, eyes distant, "there our son will not have to labor in the mines. There opportunity awaits." His words carried both hope and desperation, the dream of a life that seemed almost mythical, streets paved with gold, food abundant, respect earned through skill and determination rather than birthright. Caterina nodded, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and longing. Life in Montadoro was hard. Salvatore's work in the sulfur mines left him exhausted, his lungs scarred from years inhaling noxious dust. The family's home, though clean, was sparse. Religious icons adorned the walls, the painted eyes of the Virgin Mary following Rosario's every move as he crawled across the cool stone floor. Meals were simple: coarse bread, tomato sauce simmered in a blackened pot, and whatever produce the family could grow or barter. Scarcity was a constant companion, but love and resilience ran deeper than hunger in the Buffalino household. Rosario was a keen observer even as a toddler. He watched his father return from the mines, the yellow dust clinging stubbornly to his clothes, the sweat and exhaustion staining his skin. He noticed how his mother's hands moved, stretching limited ingredients into meals that fed them all. He heard whispers of America, stories carried back by travelers and relatives, of streets lined with opportunity, of men rewarded for their labor, of a land where a boy could rise above the circumstances of his birth. By the time Rosario turned 3, the decision had been made. The Buffalino family would join the great wave of Italian immigration to the United States. The journey would be long, arduous, and filled with uncertainty. Montadoro was left behind in tearful farewells to grandparents, cousins, and neighbors. The sea, vast and unyielding, became their path to an unknown destiny. Rosario felt only the rocking motion of the ship, the unfamiliar faces of fellow passengers, and the gentle warmth of his mother's embrace as she sang Sicilian lullabies when the waters turned rough. The day they landed at Ellis Island was a blur of shouting, stamping feet, and the sharp tang of disinfectant. Names were altered, documents processed with cold efficiency, and the Buffalinos emerged into the bustling streets of New York with a mixture of relief and anxiety. They eventually made their way to Buffalo, drawn by a small enclave of Sicilians who promised assistance and familiarity. The city was a patchwork of contrasts: grand mansions of industrial magnates beside tenement blocks packed with families struggling to survive. For young Rosario, everything was new, confusing, and overwhelming. School was no refuge. The English language was a barrier he could not yet breach, and the children, unaccustomed to accents and difference, were often cruel. "Go back to where you came from," they would jeer. Rosario learned quickly to observe rather than react, to let the world underestimate him while he calculated, recorded, and remembered. He had already begun the lessons that would define his life. In Sicily or in America, survival demanded intelligence, patience, and above all, an understanding of power. Even as a boy, Rosario's mind grasped the inequities around him. His father's hands, worn and calloused, his mother's constant labor, the poverty of their small apartment. All impressed upon him that life in America was not automatically fair, that the promises of streets paved with gold were only attainable for those willing to seize them. He watched, he listened, and he waited, a small boy with dark eyes already seeing farther than the playground and the classroom could contain. And so, in the quiet of a Buffalo winter, with snow dusting the streets and the smell of garlic and basil wafting from open windows, Rosario Alberto Buffalino began to forge himself. The shy Sicilian child, cradled in his mother's arms and whispered to in lullabies, was slowly becoming something else. A boy who would learn that the world only respected those who understood it, and that power, once glimpsed, was worth pursuing with every ounce of cunning and courage. Little did anyone know that this boy, born in a modest hillside town in Sicily, would one day walk the streets of America with a quiet authority that commanded respect, fear, and obedience. But for now, Rosario was just a child, listening to the whispers of his parents, learning the rhythms of survival, and carrying within him the first sparks of ambition that would one day ignite a legend. The icy winds of Buffalo cut through the narrow streets like sharpened blades, biting at exposed cheeks and settling into the bones of anyone unprepared for the city's bitter winters. Young Rosario, now nearly 4, huddled under a threadbare coat, his small hands tucked deep into pockets that offered little warmth. Snow crunched under his worn boots as he followed his mother and siblings through streets alive with a mixture of chaos and hope, a cacophony of immigrant voices blending with the honking of streetcars and the distant whistle of locomotives. The Italian district, their new home, was both a sanctuary and a crucible. Grocery stores overflowed with imported goods. Olive oil in chipped bottles, wheels of aged cheese, stacks of hand-rolled pasta. Through open windows, the melody of Sicilian dialect drifted, a comforting echo of the home they had left behind. But for Rosario the comfort was fleeting. He was surrounded by a foreign culture, a language he did not yet grasp, and children who could sense his difference before he even spoke a word. School became a daily battlefield. The teachers, overwhelmed by the flood of immigrants, often dismissed Rosario's silence as stubbornness or ignorance. "Speak up, boy," one stern woman barked, her spectacles sliding down her nose as she gestured toward the blackboard. Rosario simply nodded, his dark eyes observing, noting every shift in posture, every flicker of emotion. He quickly learned the subtle cues that revealed who wielded power in a room, who could be feared, and who could be ignored. The other children were less forgiving. Irish and German kids pushed him into the mud, stole his lunch, called him Rosie, with derision. Each insult, each shove, was catalogued and stored away in the quiet recesses of his mind. Rosario learned to rise without complaint, to brush off the dirt and assess his tormentors with a precision that would have unnerved anyone who noticed. Even at such a tender age he began to understand a critical truth. Respect in this world was not given. It was demanded, often through a mixture of fear, cunning, and patience. Back at home life was equally demanding. Salvatore returned each evening from work in the coal-stained streets of Buffalo, his hands cracked and blackened, lungs coughing from the unforgiving winters and the years of labor in Sicily's mines. Caterina, ever resourceful, stretched their meager provisions, simmering tomato sauce over a small stove while scolding Rosario and his siblings to behave, to learn, to survive. The smells of garlic, bread, and simmering herbs masked the bitter bite of poverty, creating a fragile warmth in their drafty tenement apartment. Rosario spent hours wandering the streets, not as a boy seeking playmates, but as an observer learning the rhythms of the city. He watched the shopkeepers, noting how some whispered with certain men and stiffened in the presence of others. He noticed the subtle hierarchies, who was feared, who commanded respect, who moved unseen and yet left an invisible mark on the neighborhood. These lessons, invisible to the untrained eye, were imprinted on Rosario with the clarity of etched stone. It was during one such wander that Rosario first encountered Vincenzo Canillo. The man ran a small grocery store, unremarkable to most, yet with an air of quiet authority that made neighbors deferential. Canillo's reputation extended beyond produce and bread. He was known to resolve problems that official channels could not, his reach extending into City Hall through networks of bribes and favors. Rosario lingered outside, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, eyes scanning every movement inside the shop. "You need something, boy?" Canilio's voice was sharp, yet measured as if weighing every word before release. I need work, Rosario replied, meeting the older man's gaze without flinching. Canilio studied him for a long moment. Come back tomorrow, 6 o'clock. Don't be late. That evening Rosario returned home, heart pounding, a mix of excitement and apprehension swirling within him. He had found his first foothold in the world that would define his life, a bridge between the innocence of childhood and the shadowed corridors of power that lurked in the alleys of Buffalo. The next morning Rosario awoke before dawn, the streets blanketed in snow, the faint orange glow of gas lamps casting long shadows across frozen sidewalks. He arrived at Canilio's store promptly at 6, swept the floors, delivered packages, and began to observe the subtle transactions that made the shop more than just a purveyor of bread and olive oil. He watched the flow of money, the whispered conversations, the cautious nods of recognition from certain patrons. Months passed and Rosario's reputation grew quietly. The boy who had been mocked for his silence was now valued for it. Discretion became his currency, watchfulness his armor. Canilio occasionally leaned down and whispered, "You're smart, Rosario?" Eyes open, mouth closed. That's rare. And Rosario, absorbing the lesson, understood that this was the path forward. Vigilance, patience, and the ability to perceive the currents of power invisible to others. At home, the pressures of survival never ceased. Salvatore's health deteriorated, his cough deepening into a harsh rasp, while Caterina aged prematurely, her hands gnarled from endless toil. Rosario contributed his small earnings, never explaining their source. Questions were few and answers unnecessary. The family instinctively knew certain truths were better left unspoken. By the time Rosario reached 10, he had grown weary of formal schooling. He no longer sought approval from teachers who neither understood nor appreciated his mind. Instead, the streets, the shopkeepers, and the silent agreements and tensions of the neighborhood became his real education. In the alleys of Buffalo's Italian district, Rosario learned the language of power, the value of loyalty, and the subtle ways fear could shape human behavior. Here, amid the bitter cold, the aroma of simmering sauces, and the constant hum of immigrant life, Rosario Buffalino was no longer merely a child from Sicily. He was an observer, a student of the human condition, a boy beginning to understand that survival required more than strength. It required cunning, patience, and a willingness to step into the shadows where others dared not tread. The snow fell gently on the rooftops, muffling the city's clamor, and Rosario, dark eyes glinting with quiet determination, walked home one evening with the realization that his journey had only just begun. America had not yet revealed its secrets, nor its dangers, but he was ready to meet both with the same meticulous watchfulness that had already begun to define his young life. By the time Rosario Buffalino reached 11, the lines between childhood and necessity had already blurred. School no longer held his interest, not because he lacked curiosity, but because the world outside its walls offered lessons far more immediate, tangible, and unforgiving. The tenement apartment where his family lived was small, drafty, and perpetually cold during Buffalo's brutal winters. Snow pressed against the windows and frozen sheets, and the faint smell of coal smoke mingled with the aromas of simmering tomato sauce and fresh bread that his mother, Caterina, so carefully prepared. Rosario's father, Salvatore, was growing weaker. Years of labor in Sicilian mines and then harsh American factories had left his lungs scarred, his hands cracked and raw. Each cough, each labored breath, reminded Rosario of the fragility of life, the relentless grind of survival, and the responsibilities now pressing upon his small shoulders. It was time to contribute, to carve a path through the streets of Buffalo where opportunity and danger existed in equal measure. The first real opportunity appeared in the form of Vincenzo Canilio's small grocery store. To outsiders it was a modest shop, selling basic Italian staples, bread, olive oil, cheeses, but Rosario quickly learned that Canilio's world extended far beyond the storefront. There were whispered exchanges at the back of the store, bundles of cash handed discreetly to men whose coats and faces bore the mark of authority and respect in equal measure. Packages were delivered not just to households, but to addresses that carried secret significance, instructions whispered in Sicilian or sharp gestures that needed no translation. "Keep your eyes open, Rosario," Canilio said one winter morning as the boy stacked crates of canned tomatoes. His voice was low, measured. "Observe but do not ask. Trust is earned, not given. Discretion is everything." Rosario absorbed the words like dry soil drinking rain. In his silence he found strength, in observation power. Each errand he completed, each glance he noticed, each small act of vigilance, became part of a curriculum far more sophisticated than any classroom could offer. He learned to recognize patterns, who deferred to whom, who carried grudges, who commanded attention without raising a voice. He swept the floors with a precision that belied his age, his movements fluid and intentional. When deliveries arrived, he delivered not only goods but quiet intelligence, noting suspicious glances, subtle interactions, and the flow of money. Every transaction became a lesson in hierarchy, influence, and the silent rules that governed this microcosm of society. Outside, the streets themselves were instructive. Young men loitered near the docks, their posture signaling ownership of invisible territories. Children of the neighborhood tested boundaries, sometimes with fists, sometimes with whispered threats. Rosario observed them all, learning who could be intimidated, who could be reasoned with, and who required a calculated display of force. By the age of 12, he could read intent and temperament in a glance, a skill that would become invaluable in the years ahead. At home, Rosario kept his newfound knowledge and skills private. His contributions helped sustain the family, but the true nature of his work was never discussed. Caterina accepted his earnings with a mixture of gratitude and resignation, sensing that the boy was learning something essential, though she dared not ask too many questions. "You are a good boy, Rosario," she said softly one evening, the lines of worry etched deep into her face. "May God guide you to a better path." Rosario smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of her words, though his mind already wandered far beyond the boundaries of that apartment. He had glimpsed the power dynamics that operated just beyond the reach of ordinary eyes, and he understood that strength was measured not merely in muscle or volume of speech, but in control, patience, and the ability to see further than one's peers. It was during these formative months that Rosario encountered his first true tests of loyalty and discretion. A shipment of goods arrived late, delayed by winter roads and inattentive hands. Canillo's eyes, sharp and calculating, swept the store. "Who noticed?" he asked. Rosario's hand shot up, steady and unflinching. "I did, sir," he said. Canillo nodded. "Good. Remember, knowledge is power, but power must be concealed until the right moment. Do not speak of this to anyone else." In silence, Rosario committed the lesson to memory. In the world he was beginning to navigate, indiscretion could be fatal. The ability to observe without comment, to understand without interference, became his armor. The seeds of a philosophy that would guide him through life were planted. Power is the ultimate currency, and fear, wisely administered, is often the most reliable form of control. The Italian district of Buffalo provided ample material for study. Rosario watched as local figures exerted influence, some through the law, some outside it. He noted the subtle ways respect was commanded: a careful word, a decisive gesture, the arrangement of a meeting that no outsider could decipher. These men, though not yet his mentors, became models of behavior he would emulate. Calm, calculating, ever aware of the currents that flowed unseen beneath the surface of daily life. Rosario's childhood, though shaped by poverty and isolation, was also one of unprecedented education. The lessons of survival, discretion, and loyalty were internalized not from books but from the rhythms of the streets, the glances exchanged in shadowed alleys, and the silent transactions in Canillo's backroom. By 13, he had become not only a trusted assistant but also a keen observer of human nature, capable of anticipating threats and opportunities with an intuition that belied his age. And so, as the harsh Buffalo winter continued to blanket the streets in white, Rosario Buffalino's character solidified. He was no longer merely a Sicilian immigrant child, but a student of power and a practitioner of patience. Every errand, every observation, every whispered instruction added layers to a young man who would one day wield authority and influence far beyond the narrow alleys of his neighborhood. In the quiet moments, when snow fell gently outside and the family huddled near the stove for warmth, Rosario dreamed of a future he could not yet name. A world where knowledge, discretion, and courage would grant him not only survival but respect, and perhaps even the kind of power that could shape men and cities alike. The streets of Buffalo had become his classroom, the winter winds his tutors, and Rosario Buffalino, ever watchful, was taking his first deliberate steps toward the life that awaited him, one measured in subtle victories, hidden influence, and the slow accumulation of control that would define his destiny. By the time Rosario reached 14, the streets of Buffalo were no longer a foreign landscape, they were a living, breathing teacher. The bitter winters had etched toughness into his bones, while the alleys, crowded tenements, and bustling marketplaces had become his classrooms. But it was inside Vincenzo Canillo's modest grocery store that Rosario's true education began, one that would prepare him for a life far beyond the confines of ordinary adolescence. Canillo's store, outwardly a humble emporium of bread, cheese, and olive oil, concealed a network of influence that extended across the Italian district. Packages arrived not just with groceries, but with instructions carefully whispered and notes passed with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Rosario had already been observing these exchanges for years, noting who deferred to whom, how money moved silently through hands, and which faces commanded attention without raising a voice. "Rosario," Canillo said one cold morning as the boy delivered a bundle of cloth to a backroom door, "you've watched long enough. Now it's time to act. Sweep floors is for beginners. Observation alone is not enough. You need to understand responsibility." Rosario listened intently. He had learned to mask his reactions, letting his calm exterior hide the storm of curiosity and anticipation within. Canillo continued, "You will deliver this package and you will make sure it reaches the intended hands without question, without delay, without error. And if anyone asks, you know nothing." He handed Rosario a small, nondescript box and a folded note. "This is your first true test. Fail and you will learn humility the hard way." The boy's heart raced, but he nodded silently. Every step he took on the snow-dusted streets carried weight now, and every interaction could shape the perception of his reliability. He delivered the package with care, noting the subtle ways recipients acknowledged him. A nod, a brief eye contact, a quiet word in Sicilian. The task was simple in appearance but rich in nuance, timing, discretion, and the ability to sense risk. Back at the store, Canillo observed his protégé. "You see, Rosario," he said, "in this world, success is not given. It's earned by those who understand when to act, when to wait, and when to speak. Silence is your greatest weapon." Rosario absorbed the lesson, feeling it embed itself into the very fibers of his being. He began to internalize a code of conduct that would guide him for the rest of his life. Discretion above all, loyalty without hesitation, and the constant awareness that every action carries consequences beyond the immediate. His responsibilities soon expanded. He kept records of small debts, monitored neighborhood disputes, and delivered messages that required tact as much as discretion. Through these tasks, Rosario observed the delicate balance of power within the community. Some men ruled through fear, others commanded respect with gestures that seemed insignificant but carried weight. Rosario learned to recognize the difference, understanding that influence was subtle and that the most effective leaders were those who could inspire obedience without overt threat. Even as he honed these skills, Rosario's home life demanded his attention. Salvatore's health worsened with each passing winter, and Caterina's hands bore the marks of ceaseless labor. Rosario shared his earnings quietly, never disclosing the nature of his work. His family accepted it with gratitude, yet there was an unspoken understanding. Certain truths were best left in shadows. This reinforced Rosario's developing belief that discretion was not merely a tactic, it was a necessity. At school, Rosario remained largely silent, but his reputation had begun to shift. The same peers who had mocked him now regarded him with a wary respect. His small stature belied a presence that was keenly aware and capable of subtle intimidation. The lessons of observation, discretion, and timing applied as much in the classroom and playground as they did in Canillo's operations. Rosario's adolescence was now defined by dual lives. By day he was a quiet boy navigating the complexities of school and neighborhood interactions. By night, or whenever duty called, he became an operative in a network that required intelligence, patience, and a fearless approach to risk. He learned early that mistakes could be costly, that trust was fragile, and that the world rewarded those who acted decisively and discreetly. The Sicilian values instilled by his parents, loyalty to family, respect for elders, and the sanctity of secrecy, were now reinforced by practical experience. Rosario began to understand that power was not merely inherited or demanded, it was observed, calculated, and seized. Each task, each delivery, each silent observation was a step toward mastery of these principles. As the seasons changed and the harsh winters gave way to brief, humid summers, Rosario's mind continued to sharpen. He tracked patterns in the neighborhood, noted who rose and fell in influence, and recorded these observations mentally with the precision of a ledger. Canillo, satisfied with his pupil, began introducing him to associates of increasing importance. Men who commanded respect and fear, who navigated the fine line between law and disorder with skill. Rosario learned to mirror their composure, to measure his words, and to act with the deliberation of one already versed in strategy. By 15, Rosario Buffalino was no longer merely an observer. He had become an operative, a student of human nature, and a practitioner of subtle power. The streets, the backrooms, the whispered agreements, they had become his true education. And though he was still a boy in years, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone much older, someone who understood that influence and respect were won through calculation, patience, and, when necessary, the measured application of fear. In the quiet moments, when the neighborhood settled into the hush of night and the lamps cast long shadows across icy sidewalks, Rosario reflected on his growing understanding. He realized that survival, respect, and eventually power required more than strength or loud declarations. They required vision, strategy, and unwavering focus. The foundation of a future empire was being laid, one careful, deliberate step at a time, in the shadows of Buffalo's Italian district. And thus, the boy who had once been mocked for his silence now walked the streets with eyes open, mind alert, and heart determined. Rosario Buffalino was learning to see beyond the surface, to understand the currents beneath, and to prepare himself for the life that awaited, a life in which discretion, loyalty, and strategic thinking would become his most valuable currency. By the age of 14, Rosario Buffalino had shed much of his childhood innocence. The narrow alleys of Buffalo's Italian district had become both his playground and his schoolroom, offering lessons that no classroom could provide. Snow-crusted streets, the scent of simmering tomato sauce, and the faint tang of coal smoke blended into a backdrop for a boy learning the hard truths of survival, respect, and power. Rosario's duties for Vincenzo Canilio had expanded beyond sweeping floors and delivering small packages. He was now entrusted with the delicate business of monitoring debts and collecting payments. It was not merely a job, it was a test of character, patience, and cunning. Each debtor presented a unique challenge, some honest but struggling, others defiant or dangerous. Rosario learned to read body language, gauge temperament, and decide when a firm word, a show of force, or simply a quiet warning would suffice. One winter morning, Rosario approached a small grocery store on the corner of the district. Inside, a man named Ricci, red-faced and scowling, leaned against the counter, counting the scant coins left in his register. Rosario met his gaze calmly. "Payment is due," he said, voice steady, unflinching. The man sneered, trying to intimidate him, but Rosario's calm observation and unwavering stance created an unspoken tension. Minutes later, Ricci handed over the money. No violence had been used, yet the message was clear: Rosario was not to be underestimated. At home, Rosario continued to contribute most of his earnings to support his family. His father's health declined steadily, the coal-stained lungs failing him in harsh winters, and his mother's hands grew ever more worn and lined. Yet Rosario never complained. He had learned that provision, like influence, was most powerful when combined with discretion and humility. At night, as he lay on a thin mattress in the drafty apartment, he would stare at the ceiling and consider his position in the world. A boy from Sicily, mocked and underestimated, now quietly wielding authority over men older and stronger than himself. School, once a place of torment, became less significant. Rosario no longer sought approval from teachers or peers. He understood that the world outside valued cunning and adaptability more than grades and recitation. Even among his schoolmates, whispers of respect began to replace ridicule. "Rosie?" some would ask, and he would now respond with a glare that made them think twice. The boy who had once been meek was developing the presence of someone older, sharper, and quietly formidable. By 15, Rosario had begun interacting with more prominent figures in Buffalo's Italian community. Canilio introduced him to men who moved effortlessly between legitimate business and shadowed transactions. Rosario observed them with a meticulous eye, noting their gestures, the subtle signals of loyalty and submission, and the quiet methods by which they maintained control. These men became unwitting teachers, demonstrating that true influence relied on a combination of perception, timing, and strategic restraint. Rosario also began to understand fear as a tool. Not wanton violence, but a carefully measured display that commanded respect and deterred interference. He realized that in this neighborhood, as in Sicily, power was not given. It was observed, earned, and defended with intelligence as much as strength. The memory of bullying at school, of being shoved into the dirt and called names, now served as a lesson in perspective. Vulnerability was temporary, but perception could be permanent. Amid these lessons, Rosario's transformation took a subtle yet profound turn. He rejected the diminutive nickname Rosie, understanding that it carried the weight of derision. Friends and associates began to call him Russell, a name that sounded more commanding, more American, and more suited to the man he was quietly becoming. The adoption of this identity was not just cosmetic, it was a statement. Rosario Buffalino was evolving into Russell Buffalino, a young man who would no longer be underestimated, dismissed, or confined by his origins. The winter of his 15th year brought new challenges. A shipment of goods intended for Canilio's network had been intercepted by a rival crew. Russell was tasked with assessing the situation, determining the culpability, and ensuring that no unnecessary attention was drawn from law enforcement. He visited the warehouses, spoke quietly with drivers, and observed the rival crew from a distance, noting their routines and vulnerabilities. By the following morning, the problem had been mitigated. Deliveries were rerouted, threats neutralized without violence, and the rivals left with a clear understanding that Russell was no ordinary boy. At home, the family remained unaware of the full scope of his activities. Caterina continued her care, and Salvatore's failing health demanded constant attention. Russell provided, quietly, steadily, without explanation. He had learned that trust and loyalty within family were paramount, even when truths were hidden. The Sicilian values instilled in him, respect, discretion, and unity, remained a guiding force even as his life diverged from the path of ordinary youth. By 16, Russell had become a figure of quiet authority in the neighborhood. Younger boys looked up to him, observing the careful balance of patience and decisiveness in his interactions. Adults treated him with deference, aware that behind his youth lay a keen intellect and a capacity for action that belied his age. He had become, in essence, a man navigating the streets with the calculation and foresight of someone decades older. Through these years, Russell Buffalino learned the foundational lessons that would carry him through his future as a prominent figure in organized crime. Observation over reaction, discretion over boasting, loyalty over self-interest, and the power of perception. Each interaction, each delivery, each moment of silent calculation was a building block in a carefully constructed foundation, a foundation upon which he would build influence, respect, and authority in the years to come. As the sun set over Buffalo, painting the snow-covered streets with streaks of orange and pink, Russell walked home from another day of responsibilities. His dark eyes, already sharp and calculating, reflected not the fears of childhood, but the quiet certainty of a young man who understood the currents of power and had begun to master them. The boy who had arrived in America as Rosario from Sicily was gone. In his place was Russell Buffalino, poised, vigilant, and ready to shape his destiny in a world that demanded cunning and courage. The year was 1920, and America had entered a new era of opportunity and peril. The Volstead Act had swept the nation, outlawing the sale and distribution of alcohol, but creating a black market that promised fortunes to those bold enough to navigate it. For Russell Buffalino, now 16, this was not merely a chance to earn. It was a proving ground, a world where skill, patience, and discretion could transform a boy from the immigrant streets of Buffalo into a man of influence. Russell's entry into this shadow economy was facilitated by his long-standing relationship with Vincenzo Canilio. The grocery store, long a hub of quiet power, now served as a node in a larger network that transported contraband whiskey, wine, and spirits from Canada into western New York. Russell was entrusted with increasingly complex responsibilities, coordinating shipments, overseeing discreet deliveries, and ensuring that the operations remained invisible to prying eyes. Each assignment demanded precision, judgment, and the ability to anticipate risk before it materialized. One brisk autumn morning, Russell boarded a small freight boat docked along the frozen edge of Lake Erie. Cases of whiskey, carefully concealed beneath legitimate cargo, were stacked in neat rows. He checked the manifest, memorized names and locations, and then stepped aboard with a calm that belied the tension around him. The crew, seasoned men who had navigated the lake's icy waters for years, treated him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Here, in the quiet pre-dawn hours, he began to understand the rhythm of organized enterprise. Timing was everything, discretion paramount, and trust scarce yet invaluable. His trips extended beyond Buffalo as he ventured into Pennsylvania, visiting towns such as Pittston, Scranton, and Wilkes-Barre. These communities, with their anthracite coal towns and dense Italian immigrant populations, were fertile ground for his operations. The residents understood him, their shared heritage allowing Russell to blend seamlessly while quietly assessing opportunities and threats. He studied local networks, noting which shopkeepers were reliable, which families held sway, and which corners of the market were ripe for expansion. Partnerships formed naturally. One of the most influential was with John Candra, a respected figure in northeastern Pennsylvania's emerging criminal landscape. Candra, 20 years Russell's senior, recognized a rare intelligence in the young man from Buffalo. Over glasses of smuggled Sicilian wine in the backroom of a legitimate grocery store, Candra observed, "Most young men want to be feared, to be seen. But you are learning first. You are watching." Russell nodded, absorbing the praise as confirmation that his approach, patient, observant, disciplined, was the path forward. As the months passed, Russell expanded his operations carefully, establishing local contacts, protecting shipments, and mediating disputes that could threaten the delicate balance of his enterprise. He began to understand that the business of illicit alcohol was not simply about supply and demand. It was about influence, control, and the subtle power dynamics that governed the communities in which he operated. The success of a shipment was measured not just in profit, but in the trust and respect it generated, the alliances it strengthened, and the fear it quietly instilled in rivals who underestimated his acuity. Russell's personal discipline set him apart from many of his contemporaries. While other young men flaunted newfound wealth through flashy clothes, women, or reckless behavior, Russell remained measured, investing in connections, knowledge, and operational integrity. He recognized that visibility could be a liability. The less ostentatious the presentation, the more enduring the influence. His appearance evolved from the modest attire of his youth into carefully tailored suits, signaling both assimilation into American society and an unspoken command of authority. Despite his growing power, Russell maintained a keen awareness of the risks inherent in his line of work. Rival bootleggers, opportunistic hijackers, and local law enforcement all posed threats that required constant vigilance. He learned to approach conflict strategically, preferring negotiation and calculation over brute force. One memorable confrontation involved a group of Irish gangsters attempting to encroach on his territory in Scranton. Instead of immediate retaliation, Russell arranged a discreet meeting, demonstrating both restraint and strategic thinking. By morning, the rivals had been neutralized, their assets reassigned, and a clear message sent. Russell Buffalino was a force not to be challenged lightly. At home, his family remained largely unaware of the true extent of his activities. Salvatore's health continued to decline, while Caterina aged gracefully yet tirelessly, maintaining the household and upholding the traditions of their Sicilian heritage. Russell provided for them, quietly ensuring their comfort, while simultaneously forging a path that would place him in the upper echelons of organized crime. It was during this period that Russell's philosophy began to solidify. Power was the only reliable currency, loyalty was sacred, and fear, when exercised with precision, was a tool of immense effectiveness. The streets of Buffalo and the coal towns of Pennsylvania were his classroom, Prohibition his curriculum, and the men he met his instructors. Each shipment delivered, each alliance negotiated, and each conflict resolved reinforced a set of principles that would guide him for decades to come. By the end of his 16th year, Russell Buffalino had transformed from a keen observer into an operative capable of orchestrating complex, multi-state operations. The boy from Sicily had become a young man who understood the interplay of risk and reward, influence and discretion, and who could maneuver through shadows with the confidence and subtlety of a seasoned strategist. The foundation for his future empire was firmly in place, constructed not through brute force alone, but through intelligence, patience, and a steadfast commitment to the code he was forging in the streets and backrooms of the northeastern United States. By the late 1920s, Russell Buffalino had grown from a keen observer into a young man commanding respect and attention within Buffalo's Italian-American community. Prohibition had transformed the city, opening avenues for profit, influence, and authority. Russell, meticulous and disciplined, recognized that opportunity was fleeting and that the ability to consolidate power would determine who survived and who was cast aside. His operations had expanded beyond mere deliveries. Russell oversaw multiple shipment routes, coordinated payments, and ensured that his allies remained loyal and his rivals cautious. He began assembling a small cadre of trusted associates, young men who, like him, understood the delicate balance between obedience and initiative. These men were chosen not only for their skills but for their discretion, their ability to act without hesitation, and their understanding that loyalty was paramount. Russell's philosophy was clear: visibility could breed vulnerability. He instructed his crew to maintain a low profile, blending seamlessly into the neighborhoods they operated in, yet demonstrating authority when required. The mere presence of one of Russell's men in a contentious situation often diffused potential confrontations. The young boss had learned that fear, carefully measured and strategically applied, was a tool as potent as any weapon. Conflicts were inevitable. Rival factions frequently tested boundaries, encroaching on territories, attempting to influence shipments, or challenging authority. Russell approached these situations with calculated diplomacy. In one notable incident, a rival group attempted to seize control of a profitable delivery route. Rather than resorting to violence, Russell arranged a discreet negotiation, demonstrating both patience and strategic thinking. By the following morning, the dispute was resolved. The rivals retreated, territory boundaries were respected, and Russell's reputation for shrewd negotiation and decisive authority was solidified. Inside his own operations, Russell emphasized discipline and accountability. Each associate was given responsibility commensurate with their abilities, but with oversight that ensured both efficiency and loyalty. He meticulously tracked debts, deliveries, and alliances, ensuring that the web of operations remained resilient and adaptable. Mistakes were addressed swiftly but discreetly, reinforcing the standards expected without drawing unnecessary attention from law enforcement or rival groups. Russell also recognized the importance of appearances. While the operations thrived in the shadows, he cultivated a public image of respectability. Modestly tailored suits, polite manners, and careful interactions with community members allowed him to navigate both legitimate and illegitimate spheres with ease. This duality became his signature approach, the ability to appear ordinary while commanding extraordinary influence behind the scenes. Family, both blood and chosen, remained central to his strategy. He maintained close ties with his parents, supporting them financially while shielding them from the realities of his work. He extended this network to his associates, creating a culture of loyalty that blended familial bonds with strategic allegiance. This approach not only strengthened his immediate operations but also laid the foundation for long-term influence across the region. Russell's understanding of human nature deepened with each interaction. He observed ambition, greed, fear, and loyalty in the faces of men and women around him. He noted which individuals could be guided through persuasion, which required demonstration of strength, and which needed careful monitoring to prevent betrayal. These lessons, learned in the alleys, backrooms, and quiet corners of the Italian district, became a personal curriculum in leadership and strategy that no formal education could replicate. As his reputation solidified, Russell began to expand his influence beyond Buffalo. He cultivated relationships with key figures in neighboring Pennsylvania towns, ensuring that his operations had reach and resilience. This expansion required diplomacy, subtle power plays, and the careful alignment of interests among diverse groups. Russell's ability to navigate these complexities distinguished him from others, marking him as a rising figure capable of both strategy and execution. By his late teens, Russell Buffalino had transformed fully from the timid Sicilian boy mocked as Rosie, to a young man whose presence commanded attention. He had mastered the art of observation, discretion, and influence. He had built a loyal cadre of associates, established authority in multiple territories, and demonstrated that leadership was earned through intelligence, patience, and strategic action. In the quiet moments, walking the snow-dusted streets of Buffalo, Russell reflected on the lessons he had internalized. The streets, the backrooms, and the whispered negotiations had taught him that power was not granted but claimed, that loyalty was earned and measured, and that fear, when applied judiciously, could secure obedience and respect. The foundations of an empire were being laid, one not built on recklessness but on foresight, discipline, and the quiet but undeniable strength of a man who understood the currents of influence long before others even recognized their existence. And so, Russell Buffalino's adolescence culminated in a blend of observation and action, preparation and execution. The boy who had once struggled to survive in a foreign land was now a master of strategy, a builder of loyalty, and a figure whose shadow would soon extend far beyond the Italian district of Buffalo. The lessons of patience, discretion, and calculated authority would guide him as he moved toward the next stage of his life: expansion, alliances, and the true opportunities presented by Prohibition America. By the spring of 1928, Russell Buffalino had emerged as a commanding figure in Buffalo's Italian-American community. His network of loyal associates was firmly in place, his reputation for intelligence and discretion preceding him. Yet even as his influence in the shadows grew, Russell understood that consolidation of power required more than operational control. It demanded alliances, legitimacy, and the careful blending of personal life with strategic advantage. It was in this context that he met Caroline Candra, the niece of his mentor, John Candra. Caroline was raised within the same traditions that had guided Russell since Sicily: a deep respect for family, an understanding of loyalty, and the subtle navigation of social expectations. She was intelligent, composed, and possessed a keen awareness of the world around her, a perfect partner for a man whose life straddled the line between legitimacy and organized crime. Their courtship was understated but deliberate. Meetings were arranged through family connections, conversations were measured, and mutual respect developed quietly. Russell admired Caroline's poise, her understanding of discretion, and her unwavering commitment to the values instilled by her family. Caroline, in turn, recognized in Russell a mind capable of strategy, foresight, and loyalty, qualities that ensured not only survival but dominance in their world. The wedding, held at St. Rose Roman Catholic Church in Pittston, Pennsylvania, was a subtle yet meaningful blend of celebration and strategy. Community members mingled with figures from the underworld, each aware of the delicate balance between family unity and influence. John Candra, observing the couple, remarked to Russell, "You've chosen well. She understands our ways, our code. She'll be the partner you need." Caroline's presence reinforced Russell's integration into Pennsylvania's criminal landscape, providing a visible anchor of respectability for both families and associates. Following the marriage, Russell's operations began to expand more strategically into northeastern Pennsylvania. The anthracite coal towns, Pittston, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, were rich with opportunity. Dense Italian immigrant populations, steady paychecks, and untapped demand for bootlegged alcohol. Russell established local contacts, coordinated shipments, and gradually shifted the focus of his activities beyond Buffalo. His approach was methodical. Relationships were cultivated carefully, transactions executed with precision, and loyalty tested through small tasks before larger responsibilities were entrusted. Parallel to his criminal enterprises, Russell invested in legitimate business ventures. He apprenticed with a local garment manufacturer, learning the intricacies of supply chains, labor management, and cash transactions. These ventures were more than mere cover. They provided a framework to launder profits, maintain a public facade of respectability, and deepen his understanding of business operations. Russell's disciplined, modest approach distinguished him from contemporaries who often squandered early gains on ostentatious displays of wealth. The marriage itself reinforced Russell's philosophy of loyalty and discretion. Caroline provided a stabilizing presence, managing their household with efficiency and grace while remaining largely unaware of the full scope of Russell's activities. Her understanding of Sicilian family dynamics ensured that the domestic sphere remained a sanctuary, a place where discretion and order prevailed. They never had children, a private sorrow they rarely discussed, yet their home often welcomed nieces, nephews, and the children of trusted associates, reflecting the family-centered values that remained central to Russell's worldview. Russell's dual life, publicly a respectable businessman, privately a rising force in organized crime, required constant attention. He refined his strategies for conflict resolution, negotiation, and influence. Disputes were handled with precision. When rival operators tested his authority, Russell would respond with measured actions that reinforced loyalty and deterred interference without unnecessary exposure to law enforcement. Each successful resolution enhanced his reputation and solidified alliances, reinforcing the perception that Russell Buffalino was a man to be respected and feared. By the end of 1928, Russell had achieved a delicate equilibrium. He was fully integrated into Pennsylvania's criminal ecosystem, strengthened by marriage, family alliances, and legitimate business ventures. His operations spanned multiple towns, his cadre of loyal associates had expanded, and his reputation for strategic intelligence was firmly established. The foundations for a long-term empire were laid, built upon loyalty, discretion, and the subtle but undeniable exercise of influence. In private moments as he walked the streets of Pittston beneath the flickering glow of street lamps, Russell reflected on the lessons he had internalized. Power was cultivated, not inherited. Fear, when applied judiciously, was an instrument. Loyalty, once earned, was sacred. His childhood, shaped by struggle and observation in Buffalo, had prepared him for this stage. The boy who had arrived timid and small in a foreign city had now become a man capable of navigating the complexities of society, business, and crime with calm authority and calculated precision. Russell Buffalino had transformed from immigrant child to strategist, from observer to executor, from Rosie to the man who would command respect across state lines. The marriage to Caroline, the establishment of legitimate fronts, and the careful cultivation of alliances marked a critical turning point in his life. The emergence of a figure who understood that the greatest power lay not in raw strength, but in the subtle orchestration of loyalty, influence, and calculated action. The spring of 1929 brought a subtle warmth to the streets of Pittston, Pennsylvania, but the air remained sharp with the undertone of winter's memory. For Russell Buffalino, these streets were no longer alien. They were the proving ground where alliances were forged, influence tested, and the foundations of an expanding empire laid. Each town he entered, Pittston, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, offered not just opportunity, but the subtle dance of power, loyalty, and caution that he had honed since childhood. Russell's operations had outgrown Buffalo. The demand for illicit alcohol was insatiable, and the dense Italian immigrant populations of northeastern Pennsylvania were fertile territory. But expansion required more than shipments. It demanded alliances, diplomacy, and a keen understanding of local hierarchies. Russell approached each town with careful study, observing which figures commanded respect, which merchants could be trusted, and which factions might oppose his presence. In Scranton he met men who had long controlled the underground trade. Instead of confrontation, Russell relied on negotiation and calculated gestures. He offered alliances, not dominance, subtly demonstrating that cooperation would yield mutual benefit while defiance would be costly. Within weeks, local operators were aligning themselves with him, drawn by his reputation for discretion, strategic foresight, and the quiet authority he projected. Russell's cadre of loyal associates accompanied him on these excursions, each trained to handle delicate situations with precision. Deliveries were executed flawlessly, disputes were mediated before escalation. Every interaction reinforced the perception that Russell Buffalino was a man who combined intelligence with measured decisiveness. Even competitors who might have underestimated a man of his stature learned quickly that his influence was not to be challenged lightly. While overseeing his operations, Russell also continued to expand legitimate fronts. Garment businesses, tailoring shops, and small textile enterprises provided both cover and additional sources of revenue. Apprenticeships within these businesses offered insight into management, labor negotiations, and cash flow, all of which he adapted to his illicit operations. This dual approach, legitimate and underground, allowed Russell to operate with minimal exposure to law enforcement while maximizing profit and influence. Russell's growing presence in Pennsylvania required careful cultivation of his personal reputation. He maintained a composed, respectful demeanor in public, presenting himself as a businessman and family man. His marriage to Caroline provided stability, projecting an image of domestic propriety that further insulated him from scrutiny. Behind the scenes, however, Russell continued to direct operations with precision, ensuring that loyalty was enforced, debts collected, and alliances maintained. Expansion was not without challenges. Rival factions occasionally tested his authority, attempting to encroach on territories or influence shipments. Russell responded with a combination of diplomacy and strategic deterrence. In one instance, a small crew in Wilkes-Barre threatened to hijack a delivery. Rather than confront them violently, Russell arranged a discreet meeting, presenting a clear choice: cooperation under his guidance or loss of territory. By morning, the rival crew had retreated, leaving Russell's operations secure and his reputation enhanced. Beyond immediate business concerns, Russell observed the subtleties of community influence. Festivals, church gatherings, and local events became opportunities to reinforce alliances, maintain visibility among allies, and subtly intimidate potential rivals. His understanding of human behavior, acquired from years on Buffalo streets and under Canilio's mentorship, enabled him to navigate these social spheres with finesse. Every handshake, glance, and conversation was measured, each contributing to the intricate web of power he was weaving across the region. By the end of 1929, Russell's influence extended across multiple Pennsylvania towns. His operations were efficient, disciplined, and strategically positioned. He had cultivated loyalty through fairness tempered with the quiet application of fear, creating a network of associates who were both devoted and cautious. His dual identity, as a legitimate businessman and an influential figure in the underworld, allowed him to maneuver fluidly between worlds, exploiting opportunities while maintaining a facade of respectability. Russell Buffalino had become more than a rising operator. He was a strategist, a negotiator, and a leader whose reach extended beyond his immediate surroundings. The boy from Sicily, once mocked as Rosie in Buffalo schoolyards, now commanded attention and respect in towns across state lines. He had mastered the principles of power he had observed in his youth: discretion, loyalty, strategic foresight, and the subtle art of influence. As winter approached once again, Russell walked the streets of Pittston, observing the snow beginning to dust the rooftops. He reflected on the journey from a child in Sicily to a man whose decisions shaped the lives of dozens and soon hundreds of people. The foundations of an empire were no longer theoretical. They were tangible, disciplined, and growing stronger with every transaction, alliance, and calculated action. Russell understood that the path ahead would demand vigilance, patience, and unwavering adherence to the principles he had honed since his earliest days in Buffalo. But he also knew that his time had come. A new chapter of expansion, influence, and authority awaited, one that would cement his status as a formidable force in the evolving underworld of Prohibition-era America. The autumn of 1930 in northeastern Pennsylvania brought crisp air and early frosts that painted rooftops and streets in silvery white. For Russell Buffalino, these were more than seasonal changes. They were reminders that time moved inexorably, and with it came both opportunity and scrutiny. The expansion of his operations had not gone unnoticed, and the first brushes with law enforcement were a sobering lesson in the fragility of influence and the necessity of insulation. Russell's rise had been methodical. Shipments flowed smoothly, debts were collected efficiently, and alliances were carefully cultivated. Yet, the very visibility that established his credibility also made him a target. One crisp October evening, as he exited a local social club in Pittston, a police officer intercepted him. "Evening, Mr. Buffalino," the officer said, his tone formal but edged with authority. "Mind if I check what you're carrying?" Russell remained calm, the product of years navigating tense situations. A quick inspection revealed a .38 revolver tucked into his waistband. It was a minor infraction, yet the encounter established his first official criminal record. He received a fine instead of imprisonment, a subtle signal that influence and reputation could mitigate consequences if handled with care. More importantly, the incident reinforced the critical need for buffers, trusted intermediaries to handle the operations that could expose him directly to law enforcement or rivals. Taking this lesson to heart, Russell began to formalize the structure of his organization. He cultivated a cadre of loyal associates, primarily fellow Sicilians and Italian Americans who shared his background and values. Each member was assigned specific responsibilities: managing deliveries, collecting payments, overseeing local contacts, and monitoring potential threats. Russell maintained oversight without direct involvement, ensuring that operational risk was dispersed and that his personal exposure remained minimal. The philosophy was simple yet profound: visibility creates vulnerability. By delegating the day-to-day activities to trusted lieutenants, Russell could direct the operations while remaining insulated from legal repercussions. Each decision was informed by careful observation, calculation, and an understanding of human behavior honed over years in Buffalo's alleys and Pennsylvania's coal towns. Mistakes were addressed discreetly, reinforcing standards without drawing attention from law enforcement or competitors. In parallel, Russell continued to cultivate his public persona. Appearances mattered. Tailored suits, measured politeness, and consistent respectability created a perception of legitimacy that masked the true scope of his enterprise. His marriage to Caroline reinforced this image, projecting stability, propriety, and a veneer of domestic normalcy. Together, they navigated social interactions with discretion, balancing personal life with the demands of an expanding criminal network. Russell's strategic approach extended to conflict resolution. Rival operators occasionally tested boundaries, attempting to encroach on shipments or influence alliances. Russell's response was measured: negotiation first, demonstration of strength only when necessary. He understood that overt violence, while occasionally required, could attract law enforcement attention and destabilize carefully maintained relationships. By balancing diplomacy with selective assertiveness, Russell reinforced his authority without unnecessary exposure. The network Russell built was characterized by layered loyalty. Associates knew their roles, understood the expectations, and recognized that discretion and reliability were valued above all else. This structure created resilience. Even in the event of a breach, operations could continue without compromising the leadership. Russell's mentorship emphasized observation, patience, and strategic action, qualities that had guided him since childhood. By the mid-1930s, Russell's influence was firmly entrenched across multiple Pennsylvania towns. The careful cultivation of loyalty, the establishment of legitimate business fronts, and the measured application of authority created a network that was both efficient and insulated. Each shipment, negotiation, and alliance reinforced his reputation as a man of intelligence, foresight, and discipline. Russell Buffalino had transformed once again. The boy from Sicily who had arrived in Buffalo timid and mocked, had become a strategist capable of managing a complex criminal enterprise while remaining largely unseen. Law enforcement encounters no longer induced panic. They were opportunities to refine protocols, test resilience, and reinforce the importance of discretion. His understanding of influence, loyalty, and strategic positioning had matured into a sophisticated framework that would guide his actions for decades to come. As winter settled over the Pennsylvania hills, Russell walked along a snow-dusted street in Pittston, observing the quiet rhythms of the town. Each shop, each alley, each interaction reinforced the lessons he had internalized. Power was cultivated, loyalty was sacred, and the careful orchestration of fear and respect could shape outcomes more effectively than brute force. In the shadows, Russell Buffalino had built not merely an operation, but a legacy in motion. One carefully insulated from exposure, yet quietly commanding authority across towns and communities alike. By the mid-1930s, Russell Buffalino had established himself as more than just a figure of influence. He had become a strategist whose reach extended across multiple towns and operations. The networks he had meticulously built were efficient, loyal, and disciplined, allowing him to operate simultaneously in Buffalo, Pittston, Scranton, and surrounding areas without direct exposure to law enforcement or rival threats. His empire was expanding, not through recklessness, but through precision, patience, and calculated alliances. Russell's reputation as a man of discretion and intelligence preceded him. Associates understood that every decision, every action, and every word carried weight. Mistakes were rare because procedures were clear, and loyalty was demanded yet cultivated through trust and opportunity. Russell personally oversaw the coordination of shipments, collection of debts, and management of disputes, but always from a position of strategic oversight rather than direct involvement. The hierarchy he established allowed the enterprise to function like clockwork. Loyal lieutenants executed his vision while maintaining secrecy and operational integrity. Alliances were key to sustaining power. Russell had developed strong relationships with influential figures in the Italian-American underworld, including members of what would later be known as the Genovese crime family. These connections were carefully nurtured through mutual benefit, calculated trust, and the demonstration of reliability. Russell's ability to mediate disputes, facilitate negotiations, and maintain the delicate balance of power elevated him above rivals who relied solely on brute force or intimidation. The Prohibition-era operations that had brought him initial wealth were now sophisticated enterprises encompassing bootlegging, gambling, loan sharking, and subtle forms of extortion. Russell recognized that control over these ventures required more than physical dominance. It required the orchestration of perception, reputation, and influence. Competitors and allies alike understood that Russell's word was final, delivered with a calm authority that left little room for argument or misinterpretation. At home, his marriage to Caroline continued to provide stability and a respectable front for their expanding network. The household functioned as both a sanctuary and a venue for discreet meetings with trusted associates, reinforcing the duality that had become the hallmark of Russell's operations: legitimate on the surface, formidable in practice. Together, they cultivated a culture of family, loyalty, and discretion that extended beyond blood ties to include chosen associates who had proven their reliability. Russell also demonstrated an extraordinary ability to assess human nature. He understood ambition, fear, and loyalty in ways that allowed him to predict behavior and plan several moves ahead. Observing a subordinate's hesitation, a rival's overconfidence, or a partner's loyalty, he could make decisions that minimized risk while maximizing control. This foresight enabled him to prevent conflicts before they escalated, maintain stability across territories, and exploit opportunities with precision. Complex operations required coordination. Shipments had to be timed, routes optimized, and personnel deployed strategically. Russell relied on his network of lieutenants to execute these plans, maintaining communication through discreet signals, trusted couriers, and careful observation. The efficiency of his system allowed him to oversee multiple territories simultaneously, ensuring that operations remained profitable, secure, and insulated from legal or rival interference. The reputation he cultivated was as important as the operations themselves. Russell was known not just as a man who could achieve results, but as a figure whose intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking set him apart. He commanded respect without the need for excessive violence. Fear was implied through careful actions and the knowledge that disobedience or betrayal would not go unnoticed. Associates, rivals, and community members alike recognized that Russell Buffalino was a man whose influence could shape outcomes quietly but decisively. By the late 1930s, Russell's empire had matured. His operations were robust, resilient, and far-reaching, with loyal associates managing day-to-day activities under his guidance. He had forged alliances, expanded territories, and built a reputation for intelligence, discretion, and strategic acumen. The boy from Montadoro, Sicily, who had once been mocked as Rosie in Buffalo schoolyards, had become a master of territories, a figure whose influence extended across state lines, and a strategist capable of shaping the underworld according to his vision. In private moments, as he walked the streets dusted with snow or observed his operations from afar, Russell reflected on the lessons that had brought him here. Patience, discretion, loyalty, strategic foresight, and the careful balance of influence and authority. The empire he had constructed was not the product of impulsive ambition, but of decades of observation, learning, and calculated action. Every shipment, negotiation, and alliance had reinforced the principles that defined him. Power earned, influence respected, and loyalty demanded and cultivated. Russell Buffalino's ascent to this level of authority was complete, yet his understanding of power continued to evolve. He knew that the stability of his empire depended not only on operational efficiency but also on the careful management of relationships, perception, and opportunity. As Prohibition waned and the landscape of organized crime shifted, Russell was prepared to adapt, ensuring that his legacy would endure, grounded in the lessons of his youth and the calculated mastery of the underworld he now commanded. The winter of 1940 had settled across northeastern Pennsylvania and western New York, blanketing the streets with snow that glinted under the soft glow of street lamps. For Russell Buffalino, the chill in the air was insignificant compared to the weight of decades of observation, strategy, and action that had defined his life. He walked the familiar streets of Pittston, his presence quiet yet commanding, a testament to a journey that had begun in a humble Sicilian hillside home over 35 years prior. From the boy cradled in his mother's arms to the adolescent who had learned the language of power in Buffalo's Italian district, Russell's transformation had been extraordinary. Every lesson in discretion, loyalty, observation, and calculated action had been internalized, honed, and applied to an expanding network of influence that spanned multiple states. He had become a man whose authority was unquestioned, whose foresight guided operations, and whose reputation commanded respect from allies and rivals alike. Russell's empire was sophisticated. Legitimate businesses, garment shops, textile operations, and tailoring enterprises provided both cover and revenue, seamlessly integrated with bootlegging, gambling, and loan sharking networks. Each layer of his operations reinforced the other, creating a structure that was both resilient and flexible. Associates managed day-to-day functions, disputes were resolved with strategic precision, and potential threats were neutralized before escalation could occur. Russell had mastered the art of influence, understanding that true power relied as much on perception and alliances as it did on force. Family remained central to his life and operations. Caroline, steadfast and perceptive, maintained the home as a sanctuary and venue for discreet counsel, blending personal loyalty with strategic acumen. Russell's connections to blood relatives, in-laws, and chosen associates reinforced his networks, providing both operational security and social legitimacy. The values instilled in him from Sicily, respect, discretion, loyalty, continued to guide his decisions and interactions, creating a culture of trust and obedience that extended throughout his network. Russell's influence reached beyond the streets of Buffalo and Pennsylvania. Partnerships with established figures in New York and connections with other emerging crime families allowed him to expand his operations, diversify risk, and enhance revenue streams. His approach to power was deliberate. Visibility was controlled, influence was subtle, and loyalty was cultivated carefully. Fear, when applied, was precise and effective, reinforcing authority without inviting unnecessary scrutiny from law enforcement. He reflected on the pivotal lessons of his youth. The bullying in school, the hardship of immigrant life, and the observation of authority figures had shaped his understanding of human behavior. He knew when to act, when to wait, and when to remain invisible. These insights became the guiding principles of his life. Power earned is enduring. Influence exercised wisely is uncontested. Loyalty cultivated is unshakable. Russell's reputation, carefully nurtured over decades, had become a form of currency itself. Allies sought his counsel, rivals measured their moves against his known strategies, and even the most cautious observers understood that his influence could extend far beyond immediate operations. The boy from Sicily, once mocked for his accent and diminutive size, had transformed into a figure whose intellect and calculated authority defined the social and criminal landscape in which he operated. Though his empire had been built in the shadows, Russell's impact was tangible. Communities understood that his influence shaped local economies, resolved disputes, and maintained order where chaos might otherwise reign. He had mastered the balance between visibility and discretion, demonstrating that leadership did not require constant display, but rather strategic deployment of presence and authority. As Russell walked along snow-dusted streets, memories of his early life in Montadoro flickered across his mind. The warmth of his mother's lullabies, the toil of his father's hands, the lessons learned in the alleys of Buffalo. Every hardship, Every observation and every careful decision had culminated in the man who now stood poised, respected, and feared, a man whose legacy was rooted in intelligence, patience, and an unwavering understanding of human nature. Russell Buffalino had transcended the limitations of his youth and environment. He had transformed adversity into opportunity, observation into strategy, and loyalty into a tool of enduring influence. The empire he had constructed, grounded in the principles learned in his earliest days, was not merely a network of illicit activity, it was a demonstration of mastery over circumstance, an illustration of the power that could be wielded by one who understood the currents of society and the intricacies of human behavior. The boy who had arrived in America timid and small was gone. In his place stood Russell Buffalino, strategist, leader, and legend. He had walked a path defined by observation, discipline, and calculated action, leaving an indelible mark on the landscape of organized crime and the communities he touched. His legacy, forged in the shadows yet visible to those who understood its contours, would endure, a testament to a life shaped by intellect, loyalty, and the subtle art of power. As the snow fell softly on the rooftops of Pittston and Buffalo, Russell paused, reflecting on a life both extraordinary and perilous. The lessons of Sicily, the streets of Buffalo, and the complexities of Pennsylvania's criminal landscape had converged to create a figure whose influence was absolute in its domain. The journey from immigrant boy to Mafia legend had been long, arduous, and exacting. But for Russell Buffalino, it was a path walked with purpose, precision, and the quiet authority that defined his life. And in that quiet winter evening, with the city hushed under a blanket of snow, the story of Russell Buffalino, the boy from Montadoro who became one of America's most formidable figures in organized crime, stood complete, a narrative of strategy, loyalty, discretion, and the enduring power of foresight.